Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today I'll be continuing with the Deku and Death series. This will be Part 5, Chapter 5, entitled Rubber Balls and Rock Bottoms. Most people didn't bother to pay any attention to a glum-looking 11-year-old as he trudged down a busy street. Of course, Gami was not most people. He desperately tried to shake his successor out of whatever funk he was in. It would not end well if he arrived at school like this. Midoriya was in a bad mood that morning. Normally, he did his best to start each day as cheerfully as possible, so he wasn't as crushed once he got home from school. He would wake up early each morning and watch whatever episode of Mighty Adventures was playing while he sorted out his souls. Gami would sit next to him, and the two of them would laugh together at Mighty Man's antics. Then, as they walked to Aldera Junior High, the man would ramble about quirks or Mighty Man, whatever it was. It always put Midoriya in the highest of moods. And that's how it was every day. But of course, not every day went without a hitch. Midoriya knew he couldn't save every person he saw in a premonition, as much as he wanted to. It was just impossible, like how every hero he couldn't save every person in need. A grim reality that was hard to accept. Midoriya understood it, but that didn't mean that he accepted it just yet. Maybe he could cope with it in due time, but right now he was a stubborn 11-year-old child who just wanted to help everyone he could. Still, understanding that harsh truth didn't prepare him for what the majority of times where he couldn't save whoever he saw. That morning, the child ended up pausing on a different channel, on his way to Mighty Adventures. He was hoping to catch the weather for the rest of the week, just to check to see if he needed to do his laundry for more shorts. What he ended up catching on the news was far worse than he expected, though not the first time it happened. It was a picture of a woman, blonde and in her 30s, the same exact one from the boy's premonition 2 days earlier. The reporter was explaining how she had been fatally shot in what Midoriya looked to be a mugging gone terribly wrong. Midoriya had only been able to catch the fact that the police were still on the hunt for her killer before his mood completely plummeted. Sure, he knew he couldn't save everyone. That didn't erase the fact that it put him into a cold sweat each time that he failed. "Izu, please," Gami pleaded with the child, frantic for some kind of reaction from him. Midoriya snapped out of his head at that, looking down at the sidewalk while continuing to walk. They were almost at the school, and the streets were starting to thin out of people. "Sorry," he mumbled out, voice dry and hoarse from the silence. He could hear the figure sigh from relief at the response. Midoriya waited for him to say more, waited for the expected lecture about how he couldn't save everyone. He waited for Gami to go on about how he could still help people, and that no hero was expected to save everyone. He waited for what he heard every time this happened, and as much as he knew Gami meant it, it had never helped as much as he wanted it to. Midoriya closed his eyes and waited. He knew it was coming, and knew it was true. But no words came. Midoriya stopped out of shock. Gami's sleeve came to rest on the boy's shoulder, and he could feel the sharpness of the bones digging into his skin. Still, no words were spoken. The child reached up to touch the man's hand with his own. It was cold, even through the sleeve, but he didn't mind. They just stood there. To any person that would be watching, it would seem as though it were pretty weird that a middle schooler had stopped abruptly in the middle of a empty sidewalk and was clutching his shoulder. It would probably seem even weirder that the same child had just suddenly started smiling at what would seem to be nothing. But Midoriya didn't mind. No words ever broke the silence. Midoriya ran down the school's empty hallways, cursing to himself. How long had he been standing on that sidewalk for? Surely it couldn't have been that long, right? Somehow it was, and now he was racing to beat the clock, as well as the late bell. The last thing he needed now was his teacher scolding him on his tardiness. It happened every now and again, where the boy didn't make it into the classroom on time, but never enough to deserve the lengthy criticism his homeroom teacher liked to give. He especially didn't want to have to stand there and take it in front of the rest of the class. Their obvious snickering always made it worse. Skidding down another hallway, he saw his classroom's entry door. Lurching for the handle, he violently turned it and yanked it open. The sudden noise spooked him out of most of his classmates as he turned to see who was at the door. Only the smirk once they realized it was him. His teacher's head turned too, face morphing into a scowl at the sight of the green, unruly hair. "Midoriya, I hope you realize that you're late," the teacher began. The boy just stopped to catch his breath before pointing up at the bell. It wasn't a second later that the bell rang, signaling that class had started and all students that came in after would actually be late. The teacher sighed and let his shoulders slump before motioning for the student to sit. Midoriya grinned and walked over to his desk, ignoring the snickers and giggles from his classmates. He outwitted his teacher for once, and that left him a decent enough mood to not be bothered by his peers. That was until one of Bakugo's crew stuck his foot right out in Midoriya's path. He flailed before inevitably falling face first onto the cold tile. All the kids in the classroom, regardless if they witnessed this scene or not, immediately began to laugh. Midoriya pushed himself off the floor before meeting the harsh glare coming from his teacher. His proud facade started to falter a bit. "Midoriya, get to your seat now and stop distracting this class," he berated, "before I find a reason to give you detention." The child faltered once more. He never had been to detention before. That kind of thing stayed on your school record, and if he wanted a shot at UA, he couldn't afford to start now. They would already be looking for ways to deny him entry due to him being quirkless. He couldn't give them a reason due to his school record. Of course, he was hoping to change his quirk records before the entry exam in 3 years, but in case he wasn't able to, he had all of his bases covered. "Yes, sir," Midoriya murmured quietly before making his way to his desk. He could feel each and every glare on him as he finally sat down. As the teacher continued with the lesson, he could feel the stairs slowly move off of his form. One in particular hung around longer than the others. He could practically feel the heat coming off of it and burning into his back. He ignored it, like usual. Bakugo was always like this, after all. The rest of the classes before lunch went pretty smoothly. Not too much had happened since the incident in Midoriya's homeroom, and for that he was grateful. When the lunch bell rang, he waited behind as the rest of the class filed out. He knew it was probably a better idea to merge with the crowd, but the boy wasn't too fond of being crowded. After years of avoiding others and lacking physical contact, he wasn't too keen on changing that on a dime. As for how it got that way, it was a combination of things. The lack of affection at home, the bullying at school, the fear of his own power growing out of control. Midoriya figured it would be easier to avoid contact in general, rather than trying to fix the problem 7 years too late. Still, he should have realized by now that trying to leave his room alone would only cause more problems. "God, Deku," Midoriya flinched at the voice. "You're so pathetic. Can't you even walk straight?" The boy would never comment on how he was tripped. He was playing for the long run, after all. Better to let them talk than try and correct them if he really wanted to outlast this nightmare. So Midoriya just ignored whoever was talking and attempted to leave the room. Of course, he would never be lucky enough to get out of that easily. "Hey, who said you could leave?" Another voice called out and grabbed his shoulder. The boy recoiled at the touch, turning around to face whoever else was in the room. It was only those 2 students who had spoken earlier, but luckily not Bakugo, though at this point Midoriya wasn't sure which was worse. He just stood there in silence and waited for the others to continue as they surely would. "Not going to say anything, Deku," the first one sneered. "You really are useless." The same kid walked towards him, a malicious glint in his eyes. Midoriya looked towards the supply closet in the back of the classroom. The teacher had gone in there just as class ended, and the child was sure that he was just waiting out the confrontation. The teachers always made it painfully obvious that they didn't care about how he was treated by the other students. The man could probably hear everything that was happening. Suddenly, the kid threw a lousy punch at Midoriya's face. He jumped back and ducked under the swing, before skittishly scampering out of the classroom. He hurried towards the courtyard, listening to the cries behind him not too far down that same hallway. Midoriya hid behind a set of open doors near the courtyard entrance, just as the 2 students raced past him. He stayed there for a good few minutes to catch his breath, before making his way outside. This was a natural occurrence, and the boy was already prepared for those. It wasn't the first time he used the same set of double doors to hide behind either. He finally reached the courtyard of Aldera Junior High, and to his relief, it was empty, like always. None of the other students really enjoyed eating away from the refreshing air-conditioned sanctuary of the cafeteria, especially on hot days like today. This made the courtyard the perfect place to get away from it all, at least for half an hour. He could talk to Gami here and sort souls in peace, and it was a win-win. Midoriya casually walked around the tree in the center of the yard. It was arguably the most beautiful part of the school. The way it thrivingly grew in a place so toxic really helped him believe that he would be able to thrive too, cheering him on like a silent fan. Its branches were tall and thick, like powerful arms holding the world up, and its leaves stayed in a calming shade of evergreen despite the awful heat. It even had a knot right in the center, which Gami had told him held a family of cardinals a few generations back. How the man knew that, Midoriya had no idea. Now the knot held the child's personal belongings, such as his occasional jacket for the colder days and his packed lunch. He stopped using his assigned locker after multiple defacings and vandalism incidents, as well as the numerous times it had been broken into. Most of the time nothing too important had been stolen, except for the one time that he foolishly stored his winter coat in it. That coat had taken a while for him to save up for, and losing it had left him awfully depressed. After that experience, Midoriya started using the tree knot to hold his items, knowing it would be far safer than his actual locker. The knot was deep enough that if any students had actually looked inside, they would be unable to actually see his stuff. The only way to confirm that something was in there was to actually reach inside, and most of the kids at school weren't brave enough to do that. He reached in and pulled out his lunch bag, the same one that he had been using for years. He sat down against the trusty tree and began to eat, doing his job as well. Gami and the boy ended up rambling on about something unrelated to the prior event, which Midoriya was thankful for. The man seemed to know when he just needed a distraction. The rest of the day had gone pretty well. Midoriya managed to weave into the crowd, and then, coming back from lunch, he wasn't even cornered again. And nothing too eventful had happened in the rest of classes. It wasn't until the end of the day that things got messy. The dismissal bell rang, and again the child let himself wait as the rest of the class would leave, before eventually leaving himself. He was on his way to the courtyard when one of the windows caught his eye. He turned towards it and realized it showed the courtyard as well as a perfect view of the tree that stood in the center. Near the tree also stood Bakugo and a group of maybe 5 others. Luckily, they weren't snooping in the knot, but they seemed to be just standing around, like they were waiting. Then it clicked. They were waiting for him. He turned to run in the opposite direction, as he was sure they would leave after long enough. But as he did, the boy that he was positive saw ahead lurch in his direction, praying that they didn't spot him. Midoriya ran up the first flight of stairs. A stampede of footsteps behind him confirmed that his worst fear was true. He raced down one of the hallways, listening as Bakugo's loud voice commanded the others to split up and corner him. He skidded down along another hallway, the stairs to the 3rd floor in sight. His signature red sneakers squeaked loudly and against the polished tile, alerting everyone of his location. He almost reached the door to the 2nd flight of stairs when one of the bullies jumped out in front of him from another hall. Midoriya dove under his outspread arms and rammed into the door where the stairwell hid behind. He scrambled on all 4s up the stairs, desperately trying to regain his balance. "He went up the stairs!" the kid who tried to catch him bellowed. Midoriya frantically tried to think of a new place to hide. He immediately ruled out anywhere on the 3rd floor, as some of the kids would likely be waiting for him there. He considered the 4th floor, but decided against it for that same reason. But what else was there? The child gasped. The roof. The janitors were supposed to lock it once school ended, but they rarely ever did their job. Midoriya would just have to bank on that fact that it would be open. Otherwise, he'd be trapped in a dead end with 6 feral kids hell-bent on kicking his ass. He picked up his pace and dashed further up the stairs. He could hear the shocked cries of the kids on the 3rd and 4th floors as he passed them completely. Good. He'd made the right choice. Now he had extra time to figure out what exactly he was going to do once he got to the roof. After all, it's not like he could really go anywhere else after that. Midoriya collided with the rooftop door and gave it a desperate push. To his outstanding relief, it swung open effortlessly, and he almost fell right onto the ground. He could hear the voices coming up faster now. He stumbled, but recovered fast enough to look around. There wasn't anywhere to hide. He was trapped. The voices had reached the roof where he was. So had the footsteps. He turned around in a panic and watched as 5 kids that liked to hang around Bakugo emerged from the stairwell. They snickered at his panicked form and started to approach him. Midoriya began to back away as they did, but eventually ran into the railing that lined the rooftop. He looked back in shock. Two of the approaching kids quickly ran to his side to seize his arms. The boy thrashed wildly at the touch, his mind spiraling in absolute agony. He hated this. The touches released something feral in his head. He hated being touched, especially out of his control. They needed to stop. Midoriya couldn't think. His mind was spinning. Let me go. Let me go. Let me go. Let me go. A sudden sock to the face snapped him out of it. He could feel the warm blood trickle down his face. He didn't think his nose was broken, but the thick trail of red was definitely starting to make him doubt it. The kid that had punched him laughed and then gave him another sock to the gut. Midoriya gasped at that, choking on his own spit. The force of the blow knocked his head back and sent a few specks of blood flying off his face. His head lurched forwards again and hung limply on his neck. The last two kids stayed by the rooftop door, watching everything play out. Then a last set of loud and harsh footsteps made their way up the stairs. Midoriya lifted his head up to meet Bakugo's stare, his eyes fluttering and desperately trying to stay open. He yanked frantically on the two kids holding his arms, not sure if it was because of the touch or just to escape the current situation, but they didn't budge. Bakugo walked closer, shoving the kid that punched Midoriya out of the way. The other two kids followed close behind. "Deku," he growled. The boy grimaced at the name, but kept eye contact with Bakugo. "Kacchan, please, I haven't even done anything today." The angry blonde scowled some more. "You think you're all that, don't you?" "What are you even talking about?" The grip around his arms tightened painfully, and Midoriya yelped. "Watch it, Deku," one of the boys holding his arms said. Bakugo stepped even closer until he was right at the child's face, but even then the timid boy never broke eye contact. It's not like Deku could accomplish anything significant being quirkless, so why was he trying so hard? The blonde grinded his teeth, desperate to get some sort of reaction out of the child in front of him. He slapped his hand on Midoriya's right shoulder and lit it up in a fiery rage. He could see the sparks leaking out from underneath his hand, now staining Midoriya's uniform. That did it. The boy's eyes tore away from Bakugo's own in unrestrained terror. The blonde had noticed that Midoriya seemed to have a sort of weak spot at his right shoulder, though he could never figure out what it was. But he was finally able to get the reaction he wanted. He wanted Deku to know exactly where his place was. Midoriya howled at the spark on his shoulder. It reminded him so much of his father. Too much. He was barely keeping it together, the memories of that night spilling into the current moment. He could feel the tears threatening to breach his eyes, but he did his best to hold them in. He couldn't cry now. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing that they won. Then Bakugo's hand lifted off of what seemed like forever. He could feel himself calm down at that, not realizing that he had been thrashing crazily before, and that the two other students behind the blonde had seemed to step in to keep him restrained. He opened his eyes to look at his former friend, but found no sympathy on his face, only hate. Midoriya could feel a hand in his hair, but recognized the cold feeling as Gami's. He tended to forget that the man was there in situations similar to this. He tried to focus his mind on the way he softly ruffled his green locks, as if the man was trying to tell him it would be okay, that it would be over soon. Bakugo kneed him in the gut violently. At that, the boy lunged over weakly, and the kids, holding his arm, suddenly let go. He fell right onto the floor, face first, as he had done earlier. Only this time, he didn't have the strength to hoist himself up. He stayed limp on the rooftop, barely able to lift his head to see Bakugo and the other 5 students making their way to the door. The kid stopped, clearly waiting for the blonde to lead them, but he also stopped at the doorway. He turned around to look at the prone Midoriya. "Remember your place, Deku," he stated, something he never failed to remind the boy. "A quirkless loser like you can never be a hero." And with those parting words, all of them left the rooftop. Midoriya pushed himself to his knees and slowly made his way to the railing where he'd been cornered just before. The railing wasn't too high, only just reaching about to his waist, but the bars holding it up were spread pretty widely apart. The boy slipped his legs through the spaces so he could dangle off the edge. He would have climbed over the railing to sit on the thin ledge that separated safely and falling down to his doom, but there wasn't enough room. Gami did the same, his robe flowing in the high wind. They sat there in silence for a bit before the child broke it with a sob. The sobs grew louder and heavier until Midoriya could hardly breathe. He was crying so profusely that the sounds just stopped coming out. He brought his gloved hands to his mouth and simply kept them there, trying to drown out the sobs that couldn't be heard. "I don't understand," were the first words to be spoken through the sobs, though they were muddy and almost inaudible. "Why do they hate me so much?" He could feel Gami's hand move from his head to his back, rubbing circles into it. The man didn't say anything, though, opting to let the child continue ranting. "I can't do this anymore. Why can't I be free? Why can't this be over?" The boy let his head rest against the railing, staring down 4 floors to the ground. It would be so easy, fast, painless, but it would never work. His role as death made that sure of that. He had tried in the past, his thoughts going back to that moment. Gami had been trying to tell him something, but he was so desperate for release he didn't listen. He ran down to the bathroom, opened the medicine cabinet, downing as many things as he could find. After a few minutes, he was convinced that he simply hadn't taken enough things, but then Gami introduced him to another ability he had as death. Midoriya viewed it as more of a curse. He remembered Gami telling him when he first got his powers that each death was required to work for a minimum of a century. Now he knew how they enforced it. To put it simply, he had immortality. He couldn't die, no matter how much he craved it. He could still get hurt and burned and scarred, but he didn't die. Gami had told him it was so death could work without any distractions, but Midoriya figured it was just a way to keep death stuck in this invisible contract, so they really couldn't get out of their duties. It was cruel, and he hated it. Of course, after finding that out, he desperately didn't want to believe it, so he tried a few more times in a few different ways, but none of them ever worked. He remained stuck in this hellish nightmare. The boy snapped back into reality at the cold touch of the man's hand on his own. He didn't break eye contact with the ground, though. "I never thought I wanted much in life, but," he started, not really knowing where his head was going with this. Gami turned to look at him, his hands still unmoving. "My whole life, I guess the few things I've wanted I can't have." Midoriya moved to look at his gloved hand. "I guess I can add this to the list." But at those words, the child could feel soft sleeves wrap around him. It took him for just a second to figure out what was happening. He was hugging him. Despite Gami being the only person on the roof, he hadn't been hugged in such a long time it felt alien. He slowly wrapped his own arms around the man, unsure if he was doing it right. The two of them stayed there for just a bit, just silently reassuring themselves that they still had each other, if no one else. "Izu, you and I both know you're going to become the greatest hero, and nothing will ever stop you," Gami finally said, breaking the quietness. "Not them, not the world, and surely not this." Midoriya stayed quiet at that, but the man could hear the thinnest of sniffles coming from where the boy's head was perched in his robe. He smiled, though it went unnoticed, and hugged tighter. His successor was going to take the world by storm one day. Midoriya stumbled down the school's fire escape in a hurry. He didn't think he could take the stairwell back down. He had taken too long on the roof, and if the janitors caught him in the school after hours, it wasn't going to end well. So he opted for sliding down the rusty fire escape. After all, it was much safer than just jumping off the roof and waiting for his bones to heal in the morning. See, concerning his immortality, Midoriya had learned an important aspect about it much earlier in the past. The immortality didn't give him any regeneration factor, but healed any injuries that could prove detrimental to his job. After an overnight's rest, handy but not too impractical in the midst of a fight. So yes, while he could jump 4 stories off the roof of his junior high and be all right, he'd also be a pile of broken bones and mush until the morning. As for why he was in a rush, well, Gami had the decency to remind him he was supposed to be at Ishihara's for tea in 10 minutes. Even since saving the man from his unsightly demise, he would still be invited over for tea and snacks for 1 or 2 times a week. He enjoyed Ishihara's company, as the two of them loved to chat about just anything, kind of like him and Gami. Plus, there were times where Ishihara would pull out his old chessboard, and while the older man would usually win, Midoriya loved it nonetheless. The boy learned a lot about Ishihara during their tea chats. The man apparently had a super neat tracking quirk he got to name Under the Radar. It allowed him to place undetectable, irremovable trackers on up to 3 items at once, even people. It didn't have a size or range limit, and the trackers couldn't be removed unless Ishihara himself released them. All in all, Midoriya thought it was absolutely amazing. The only downside to it was the man would go randomly blind at times, which led to the incident that caused the two to meet. But now wasn't the time for the child to be gushing about the man's quirk. He sprinted down the busy sidewalk, ignoring angry protests of commuters he bumped into along the way. Turning a corner, he now had the quaint blue house in his sight. The boy didn't have a watch or a phone, so he had no idea whether he was late or not. Hopefully he wasn't, though. Midoriya really didn't want Ishihara to start asking questions. He ran up the stairs and rang the doorbell. After a few seconds, the door clicked and opened up. "Oh, Midoriya, you made it right in time," the man's voice echoed behind the wood. The child let out a sigh of relief. He made it in time. He looked up to meet Ishihara's eyes. "Oh my goodness, what happened to your face?" Midoriya reached a gloved hand to touch at his face in confusion. He pulled it away only to find a decent amount of red staining it. Right, his nose. He'd assumed it had stopped bleeding by now. Guess it hadn't. The older man ushered him inside and shut the door behind his smaller form. The boy was pretty dazed during it all, but remembered Ishihara sitting him on one of the dining room chairs and cleaning up his face. The man then got up to throw away the bloody tissue before getting a new one. It was the kids at school, wasn't it? He spoke softly. It seemed like a lot of people were doing that today. Midoriya didn't say anything back, but the way he looked away from Ishihara's concerned stare gave the man all the answers he needed. Midoriya, I know you don't like talking about it, but can you at least tell me why they're hurting you? The child's brows furrowed at that. Sure, he had known Ishihara for a good 3 years now, but even then, how would he react knowing that the boy's biggest secret? Well, I guess it wasn't his biggest per se, but definitely the most detrimental. Would those 3 years of friendship go completely down the drain? Midoriya didn't want to risk that, ever. He looked back at the man's eyes and immediately regretted it. Staring into those full of concern eyes made his heart swell with guilt. The lump in his throat grew larger, and the boy was afraid he would start crying again, but was either that or talk, and Midoriya refused to do the latter. So the tears fell down his face silently, and Ishihara moved to quickly wipe them away before they mixed with blood on his nose. But even that wasn't enough for his conscience, apparently. I'm quirkless, he sputtered out. What was he doing? He tried to stop, but his mouth just didn't listen. But I still want to be a hero and save people. Ishihara listened silently as he continued. The other kids at school, they know, and they don't like it. That's when his mouth gave out on him, and he went back to crying. There it was. It was out. He waited for Ishihara to reject him like everyone else did. He would never get to enjoy tea and snacks or talk or play chess with him again. It was over. Oh, Midoriya. And for a second time that day, he felt arms wrap around him. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. He looked over at the man's face in shock. You're not mad? Then it was Ishihara's turn to look shocked. Why would I be mad? It's just 'cause, he murmured. Most people are when they find out. Well then, I guess I'm not most people, the older man reassured. Besides, you've already saved my life. You're a whole step ahead of those kids. The child's face changed into one of confusion. You really don't care that I'm quirkless? Ishihara smiled. I meant what I said when we first met. Quirk or not, you're going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya. And that finally broke the dam, and the boy bawled his eyes out. But with Ishihara at one side and Gami at the other, there were more tears of happiness than anything else. Midoriya fiddled on the couch while Ishihara handed him a plate of chocolate chip cookies covered in plastic wrap. The man was nice enough to package away some of the spare treats that he prepared. The two had enjoyed tea and those same chocolate chip cookies earlier, after the man cleared up the child's face and Ishihara wiped out his old chessboard. Of course, the older man still won the game, but the boy didn't really mind. Ishihara really did a good job of lifting his mood from the depressing mess it had begun as. But as all things, it came to an end when the small alarm by the living TV had rang. Oh well, 6 already, Ishihara sighed and looked at the small boy worryingly. You can stay a bit longer if you'd like. Midoriya shook his head vigorously. No, I'll be all right. He pushed himself off the couch, still feeling pain where he was punched earlier. Bakugo's follow-up attack didn't exactly help either. He hadn't found the time to check the area yet, but guessed a decently sized bruise now dressed it. He landed roughly on his feet, stumbling slightly but catching himself on the armrest of the couch. Ishihara looked at him in concern, but the child flashed one of his signature bright smiles in reassurance. The man passed him the wrapped plate of cookies that Midoriya put on his couch so that he could get up. Don't worry about bringing the plate back, the older man said. I've got plenty. The boy took the treats from Ishihara and held them close to his chest, afraid he'd drop them the second that he left the house. Today had been a roller coaster of events as well as emotions. He still hadn't gotten his hands to stop sweating or his knees to stop shaking. But he wasn't hyperventilating anymore, and his heartbeat wasn't drowning out the rest of the world, so the child still considered it a win. During Midoriya's internal reflection, he had made his way to the front door, which Ishihara held open for him. Thank you for everything, Ishihara-san, he whispered out, just loud enough for the man to hear. It really means a lot to have your support. The older man smiled at that. Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro. Midoriya giggled. Gami may end up giving the man a run for his money, but Ishihara didn't need to know that. The boy trotted down the front steps and started down the sidewalk, clutching his plate of cookies tightly. Gami followed behind, quiet as ever. See you Thursday. Ishihara called out from the doorway, hopefully. "After school?" The child turned to look back before displaying another heartwarming smile. "Sure thing. See you then." Midoriya continued towards his house as he heard the wooden door click shut. Gami moved to walk next to him, but didn't say anything. He looked at the man in confusion, but silence remained. He shrugged it off and went back to gazing at the plate of cookies. Ishihara really knew how to bake, and the boy was grateful that the man shared it with him. He could count maybe 10 or 12 cookies under the plastic wrap. Oh, no, he couldn't even wait to get another one before he got home. "Izu." The child looked back at Gami expectantly, but continued to walk. When the man seemed to hesitate, he motioned for him to keep going. "Do you remember what I said about being around to teach you the basics of your job?" Midoriya nodded, still not being able to put the pieces together. "And that I would finally be able to rest, once you could handle yourself." Once the man finished, it finally clicked for the boy. No, not after all they'd been through together. Not after today. His heart couldn't take it. Sure, the child had Ishihara, but that was only a couple of times a week. If Gami left, he'd really be alone. His hands were shaking profusely now, and his grip on the plate slipped. But Midoriya didn't even care. He waited for the loud crash of the ceramic against the concrete sidewalk and hoped that the noise would shake him out of his head. But no sound came. He craned his neck to look down, expecting to see the plate shattered and the cookies spread out on the ground, but instead turned to see Gami knelt down. The plate lay in his hand, completely intact. He rose back up and outstretched his arm to hand the plate back. "Izu, please," the man whispered. "Just listen." Midoriya took the plate back, teary-eyed. They threatened to fall again for the third time that day, but he nodded nonetheless and waited for him to continue. He would hear his friend out. Gami deserved that at least. "What I said was true, even if it was all those years ago." He kept listening, despite the growing lump in his throat. "And after these 7 years together, I know you are more than capable of handling yourself in this position." It was growing harder and harder to listen. The boy stopped walking altogether, having to put all his focus on not bursting into tears. "By those words I said so long ago, I should be ready to move on and finally enjoy peace after all these centuries. But—" The man paused, and Midoriya could hear him take in an audible breath. He dared not to look at him in fear of breaking down. "I have grown to enjoy your company, Izu, and now, though I am technically dead, I have never felt more alive." Gami seemed to stumble over his words, and the child finally gained the courage to look at his friend in the eyes, or at least where he presumed his eyes would be. It was impossible to see any of the man's face under that dark hood of his. "I believe what I am attempting to convey is that I care for you, and I am not ready to move on just yet." Midoriya's eyes widened, and a few tears slipped from his grasp. "You are more than just my successor. You are my friend, and I wish to be around you as you grow. I wish to watch you spill your cereal each morning and hopefully change your breakfast tastes to be more than just Mighty Smacks. I wish to watch hero cartoons together with you when we get back in time to catch them. I wish to have more conversations that seep into the late nights about quirks or heroes or whatever had plagued the day. I wish to support you as you continue fighting for your dream." The man fiddled with his long sleeves, picking at them from inside with his bony fingers. He hadn't imagined this conversation to be as hard as it currently was. He broke eye contact with the boy standing in front of him, not like anyone could tell. "I want to be there when you become the greatest hero Japan has ever seen." Gami lifted his head up at the first few sniffles, but was completely unprepared when his successor embraced him in a crushing hug, the plate of cookies on the sidewalk. He hadn't heard them break, so the child must have placed them down. "You really mean that?" Midoriya whimpered out, eyes puffy, cheeks red, and face utterly soaked in salty tears. "I don't want you to stay if that makes you unhappy. You're my friend, Gami. I just want you to be happy." The man did make out what the boy was trying to say, though it was nearly inaudible due to his guttural sobs and hoarse voice. "I meant every word." Gami couldn't recognize the voice that just spoke. It was so full of emotion. Was he crying? He truly had no idea. "I want to stay." It was quiet, except for Midoriya's sobs. They merely stood in the center of an empty sidewalk, embracing, a plate of plastic-wrapped cookies at their feet. If any person was watching, it would seem pretty weird that a small middle schooler had stopped abruptly in the middle of an empty sidewalk with a plate of cookies on the ground near his feet. It would probably seem even weirder that that same child was currently hugging himself while crying loudly. But Midoriya didn't mind. He didn't mind at all. This concludes Part 5, Chapter 5 of Deku and Death. I'll pick up with chapter 6 here as soon as possible for you guys. As always, thank you so much for listening.